Hello, and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is very much an introductory video lecture on mostly Aristotle's rhetoric, although we'll cover some other basic concepts from Aristotle. For those of you who are in my classes this semester, you have recently read several dialogues by Plato. So if you're out in the world and you're coming across this video, there might be some references to things that I have not covered in earlier video lectures. So just be aware of that. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint here. It's not it's not a really elaborate PowerPoint, but it will get the job done for us here. So let me just go to a slideshow. Um, Actually, I've got to just share my screen. Sorry. Here we go. Share the screen. And now go to slideshow and play from the start. So my main goal here is to give a little bit more elaboration on what this subject or the idea of rhetoric is here, and particularly in relationship to philosophy as well. In class lectures and at various times throughout my own thinking in general, I tend to use this tension between rhetoric and poetry, or rhetoric and poetics. Rhetoric being partly about the stylistic and the ways that we organize, whether we're talking about speaking or songwriting or composing an essay or whatever, versus poetics, which is more like what something is made out of. So, right, from the beginning, folks should just know that in Greek language, the term um, poiesis, which we get the word poetry from, is really just the verb to make. So when we're talking about poetry in the sense, or poetics in the sense that I'm talking about in this particular lecture, we're really talking about, we could talk about like the poetics of architecture, the poetics of literature, the poetics of songwriting or something like that, like the things that things are made out of. And then when we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about the ways and choices that go into to how we present our material in different mediums. So in the ancient world, there's a tension between this idea of philosophy and rhetoric. Um, and so when we think about definitions of rhetoric, of course, yes, in daily speech, people talk about, oh, that's just rhetoric or mere rhetoric or something like that. There's an ancient discipline associated with this. So I'm trying to give a little bit more of a description for what that is here. In the classical sense, and especially in Aristotle's sense, in his The Rhetoric and the Poetics, which you can find nice books like this, which contain both of those works of Aristotle. Um, in Aristotle's terms, uh, classical definitions of rhetoric refer to the art or the technique of persuasion. And a lot of times, if you did like a Google search for the term rhetoric, that's one of the definitions that will easily come up. Aristotle is living in an earlier democratic society, although there are definitely challenges to the democracy in Greece for the time that he is living in and writing in, and he's being influenced by his teacher Plato, who of course used Socrates as a mouthpiece in many of his dialogues. Plato, if you don't know, is not the, or at least Socrates in most of the dialogues, is not really sympathetic to democratic culture, right, or democratic society. So when we talk about ancient Greek democracy or something like that, you don't want to associate ancient Greek democracy with Socrates exactly, or with Plato, because a lot of what's happening in Plato's dialogues is a critique of the society of Greek democracy after the Peloponnesian War and all sorts of contexts. So in that the context of Plato's dialogues, Socrates is really dealing with a time in Athens that's um, uh, where Athens has been defeated. It's under the rule of 30 tyrants, and people are wondering what governance should be or what a good form of governance ought to be, which is why Plato writes one of his most famous books, right? The Republic, or the Politeia in Greek, and trying to describe what the ideal society is. If you've been in my face-to-face classes, you know we've talked about the kind of ideal society that Plato presents in the Republic, the idea that there are not is not just a philosopher king, like a single king, because that would be like a monarchy, right? But there is a philosophical class of people who are educated in particular ways and who have the characteristics and the knowledge, who have left, to use the allegory of the cave metaphor, who've left the cave and seen a greater version of how reality is structured, right? Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality. Uh, the philosopher class, or the person who's left the cave, comes back and tries to tell the other people in the cave who've only been seeing shadows presented on the wall as um, reality. And so, of course, they don't believe the person who's gone outside of the cave and experienced the way things perhaps really are. And so, the dilemma of the philosopher is somebody who can see a bigger picture, but is always in this kind of relationship where people are not necessarily believing what they say. That's part of an allegory for philosophy, but it's also, of course, in the ideal society that Plato wants to present, there's the philosopher class, and then there's this class of people called the auxiliaries or the military class, and they're characterized by their passions. And then there is the producer class, who is like agriculture farmers who produce the foods for the rest of society. The auxiliaries protect the rest of society, and then the philosophers become the rulers of the society. So there's a kind of hierarchy there, and you can see within that description that I give of very briefly of Plato's thought, there is a kind of elite class in his ideal structure at the top. Interestingly, when we think about an individualized version of that, you can very much see Plato's Republic in something like Sigmund Freud's sense of the self, right? That we have a super ego who's like able to sort of determine what is morally right, what's right by convention and tradition, that's able to keep our ego in check in a way. But our ego is very passionate, wants to has courage and bravery, like the auxiliary class. And then there's the id, which is just sort of like base desires, right? So you can see how Freud has kind of taken a version of that in his own thinking, and it's useful to think about that, because we live in such an individualized culture today, which I think I will attribute briefly to the grand influence of Euro Christianity over the past 2,000 years. So the way Aristotle and Plato are talking about um, philosophizing, it's easy for us to take a modern political subject, especially somebody like me who's living in the United States, and uh, project that subjectivity back into ancient Athens. I think that's not a really great way of doing reading. So we have to have a little bit more of a fluid sense of what the self or what individuality might be or subjectivity might be when we're thinking about classic society. But nevertheless, of course, Western civilization, as they call it, has oftentimes turned back to the Greeks because they have an early version of democracy. And in a democratic society where I am, at least in name, living today, where citizens' voices count in deliberations and count in voting, for example, we are endlessly in a place where people are trying to persuade us in one way or another, to vote for them, to side with them, to believe in whatever their message happens to be. And that's where rhetoric comes in, right? So Aristotle says that, like, in an ideal world, we would all think logically, we would all like participate in civil um uh philosophical conversation like Socrates wants us to have. But we know Socrates gets killed. He gets executed, and even though he's trying to teach people how to have uh, philosophical conversations about the concepts like the good or the just that are going to bring us to blows because there aren't really clear answers or definitions for those concepts that in philosophy we call analytical concepts sometimes, right? If it's a matter of how many chairs are in the room, if we're in a room together, we can just sit and point and count them. If there's a disagreement between how many chairs there are, we can count it out. But Socrates is frequently saying to Euthyphro, to Meno, it's when we get to like abstract concepts that if we don't approach each other with a kind of friendship as a basis, we can come to blows, we can become enemies, right? And so we see in the Gorgias, for example, that Callicles and Polus are very much talking about like might is right in that in that argument. And Socrates pits himself against rhetoricians or the sophists, the teachers of rhetoric, because in the ancient Greek society, you have a democracy, and then you have in the fifth century BCE, before current era, right? You have professionals who've learned from situations over in Italy and Sicily, or the island off the coast of Italy, anyway. Um, uh, they have professionalized a, a way of teaching people to advocate for themselves in courts of law. That when they come to Athens, they are charging money for that sort of thing. Socrates doesn't believe that you should charge money for teaching people rhetoric, and he's pretty suspicious about the whole concept of rhetoric because he believes like if we're really just doing a philosophical conversation, then we're all going to be after the capital T truth all of the time. And yes, we might disagree with each other, and we will have to work it out through dialogue or dialectic, through question and answer. Um, but uh, that's not really how things actually work. And I think that Aristotle is very much more open to how practical communication works. So it would be nice in an ideal world, perhaps, to have conversations like Socrates wants to have all the time. But a lot of people, in the Euthyphro, at the end of Euthyphro, if you remember, like Euthyphro's like been talking and he gets kind of caught up in one of the perplexed moments that reoccur in these dialogues. And then he's like, I gotta go, Socrates, like I don't have time to sit around and philosophize with you all day. So time is going to be a big element when it comes to practicality. And we might not finish our philosophical conversations before a decision is necessary for how we're going to do things in the future. And I think that that speaks quite a bit to Aristotle's interest. So Aristotle says, ideally, we would all think logically all the time, and we would, through philosophical discussion, come to an agreement, at least if it weren't just an agreement, come to actual knowledge of a capital T truth. But since we live in a society where people are often persuaded by how loud someone's voice is, or how charismatic they might seem, how beautiful or attractive they might look, we need in a democratic society to have a study of rhetoric so that we can understand the techniques for the means of persuasion that are occurring. If anything, I mean, in a really practical sense, if anything, not always even to be rhetoricians ourselves or great speakers or orators, but in order to be aware of how we might be susceptible to manipulation by others as well, right? So we get this element of critical thinking coming into early rhetoric. So in early democracies such as Greece, there's a lot of homogeneity among the citizens. The only people who can vote in the ancient Greek democracy are Greek-speaking men. So 80% of the population is like women, children, slaves. They don't get a vote. But if we think about it, like if in the ancient Greek society, it's like you go and you're listening to other people who already speak your language, and then you're debating with them. We live in a much more diverse world in the 21st century. So we have to think about how rhetoric changes over the past 2,500 years. Although Aristotle is still important, his concepts are important. And of course, they're regularly taught in high school classes, in composition or writing classes, as we encounter Aristotle's rhetorical terms. I'm going to try and give, as I've already been giving, a little bit more nuanced historical and philosophical background here as we can maneuver on here. So, um, yeah, in the ancient world, it just meant the technique or art of persuasion, but that makes a lot of assumptions about how communication works. And so, what we realize in 21st century communication is that it's not maybe so much of a one-to-one, like I'm talking to you in a conversation and I convince you to change your opinion about something. So when we think about defining rhetoric today in the 20th century or 21st century culture as well, but in the 20th century US culture, the civic culture saw great expansions of inclusivity and citizenship privileges, particularly in terms of gender and ethnicity or race. It is not that those problems around those categories are solved in by any means, but we've definitely saw with women getting the right to vote in the early 20th century, with the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1950s, that we see an expansion of who is included as a full citizen in the United States. Because we can't assume homogeneity. We can't, in terms of language, like people speak a lot of different languages in the United States, even though some people get really mad about it, right? But especially where I live in Colorado, in the middle of the United States, which Colorado is a Spanish word anyway. Um, Besides having immigrants from all over the world, there's a always has been a lot of a high amount of our population that are Spanish speakers here, since before we were a state, as any Chicano person will tell you. Uh, so we can't assume sameness or homogeneity in language or ethnicity or gender expressivity, etc. We also can't assume, in the 21st century, a static identity for the audiences that we address, or even ourselves. So rhetoric and our definitions of it have broadened in meaning to encompass communication more generally. Just think about the situation I'm in right now, where I'm talking on a video, yes, for my immediate students who I have this semester in classes, but also being available out on YouTube, to anybody who has access to the internet and who can understand the English language, right? So lots of different contexts might be at work for you depending on where you are at when you're encountering this video. In the 21st century, we need to think of rhetoric in terms of the stylistic comportment that we use when we are addressing audiences. Um, uh, and I think, especially, although it's in Aristotle, I think what we need is a heightened awareness of what we will call the rhetorical situation. Um, we also know, as I'll get to at the end of this talk, a lot more about our brains, the human brain, and how things work today. So one of the ways that things work instead of one-to-one argumentation today in terms of persuading other people, um, uh, has to do with what people in cognitive linguistics and cognitive science in general say frames or call frames. So much of practical persuasion today occurs at the level of the frame. I'll say more about that at the end. We can also think very quickly here about our cookies feeds. If you're watching this video on YouTube, or you're looking at the ads that come up on your computer screen, which may come from other things that you've looked at online. If you look for a coat, you buy a coat, but you still keep getting ads for coats on all of your social media. That's one way that persuasion is happening at an almost unconscious level. In some cases, as with like TikTok or something like this, you have apps that are literally picking up on your conversation when you're talking to people in the room. So you might have a conversation, and then all of a sudden, something almost magically appears in your cookies feeds related to the conversation that you had. So we live in a highly mediated environment today. Aristotle's concepts are important, but we also have to remind ourselves that we live in a really different context. So, carrying on here, back to the ancient world, there is this tension between philosophy and rhetoric. Socrates wants there to just be philosophical conversation. He's suspicious of rhetoric, but we know, those of us who read Gorgias and Phaedrus, we know in the Gorgias that Plato is really, really kind of down on rhetoric, says that it's just a knackery or just cookery. That it's not anything to be particularly valued at all. But by the time we get to the Phaedrus, which is a much later dialogue, we see that there might be a way that we can think about rhetoric as persuading us into right kinds of action, and it might be have something even divine in its quality there. Nevertheless, there's this tension that's long-standing between philosophy and rhetoric. Plato's dialogues demonstrate the development of Socratic dialectic over time. So, through dialogue or question and answer, we push our thinking towards conceptual truths or forms. Plato's metaphysics suggests that there are ideal forms that are always and eternally truly real, like math, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's going to still be 2 plus 2 equals 4 like 5 minutes from now, and it was that before. So we can rest assured on that kind of capital T version of truth. Aristotle, however, develops early writings on rhetoric, and he looks at philosophers and sophists. He looks at Gorgias, who, of course, shows up in the earlier dialogue by Plato. He looks at one of Gorgias's speeches, like the encomium of Helen, where Gorgias gives us an example for how Aristotle begins to analyze concepts of rhetoric employed to persuade others. Although I'm not talking about it in this video, Aristotle also has another text called the Poetics, where he uses Oedipus by Sophocles, a tragedy written by Sophocles about Oedipus, um, even more ancient Greek figure, who everybody in Sophocles' time would know the Oedipus story, right? So when the playwright writes the story of a historical person, everybody knows how it's going to come out, but what we're analyzing is the way that the playwright has put the situation together, right? Um, in the rhetoric, the encomium of Helen ends up being an example piece. Both Socrates and Gorgias, if we go back to that dialogue, will refer to logos, which is really the Greek word for word, like WRD, or verb in Latin, verb, is the word for word. So there is something about logic and rationality that is particularly tied to speech in these thinkers. Uh, Socrates is not especially into writing. If you've read the Phaedrus, he is more and he wants to have immediate person-to-person communication, which in an environment like the internet, right? One of the advantages is that if this were just a Zoom call, you and I could talk to each other directly, no matter where we were in the world. But in most cases, we're living in a detached, decontextualized, mediated environment, right? So this, as you're watching this video, I, might be out riding my bike. Um, so Aristotle says we don't really live in uh, Plato's world of ideal forms, even if that might be a way to think about how the universe is structured. And so he says, kind of living in this life, what we need to deal with is this notion of phronesis. It doesn't show up a lot in the rhetoric book, but this is kind of broader from Aristotle's philosophy that I'm boiling down here. So while Plato, through Socrates, emphasizes ideal and eternal forms, Aristotle's philosophy emphasizes phronesis, which is a Greek word that means practical wisdom or prudence in government and public affairs. It's a type of intelligence or a type of wisdom that's concerned with practical action, and it's often described as the wisdom of action. So, just something to think about. Aristotle is really concerned with the notion of action itself, which must happen in embodied forms in this particular world. Isn't in the realm of ideal forms, right? Like the ideal table, that the concept of table that includes all versions of table that might exist. Yeah, we might have individual examples of a table, but what is eternal and true for Plato is the ideal concept, right? Phronesis is not about that. Phronesis is actually about living in a world where physical bodies are in movement and in change, and sometimes directed by some sort of guiding principle, which he might call the prime mover as the very first thing that sets things into motion, which is kind of like a God type idea. And then there is the question of our own bodies and embodiment and how our bodies exist through time, and to what extent we have control through our rationality, through our soul, if we want to use Plato's terms, how we determine our actions in the world. So there's an emphasis here that makes Aristotle's thought feel more of this world than Plato's. But taking a cue from his Phaedrus, Aristotle also digs into the subject of rhetoric as a practical um, manner. And I just skipped a sentence here on my PowerPoint. Aristotle ends up being more democratic and less suspicious of rhetoric than Plato slash Socrates. And because of that, he says, let's dig into this concept. Let's think about the practical uses of rhetoric. So it's like when I say Aristotle versus Plato, he's not rejecting Plato, but he's amplifying on some of Plato's earlier thought and on the tensions between rhetoric and philosophy that show up in Plato. Um, Aristotle gives us another couple of texts where he wants to treat logic as a branch of philosophy, as it's a separate branch, separate from metaphysics, separate from ethics, for example, separate from epistemology or the study of the nature of knowledge. So Aristotle is very much into like breaking things down into categories or making hierarchies of categories or taxonomies, as we call them. Uh, he distinguishes between formal logic and sort of practical logic, right? So this isn't a lecture on formal logic, but when we look at a formal syllogism, like this, look at what's in bold here. All men are mortal. Socrates is or was a man. And the conclusion here is therefore Socrates is or was mortal. This is a really, really common syllogism. You may have encountered it in someone else's video lectures or in classes or in a textbook somewhere. Uh, Usually it's a sentence. Sentences in English, anyway, are formed through subject, verb, object. The word order in English is what we call syntax in linguistics. That's a fancy word for word order. So we have three terms. We have the subject, men. We have the verb, are, and we have mortal, right? Which is being equated to something about men. So the term A, men, equals in a way the term B, mortal, or the quality of being mortal and having a finite life. Notice that the predicate adjective, mortal, right? sometimes leaves out an implied noun here. I mean, it might be more clear to say all men are mortal men, but it's also repetitive to say that, right? So the term mortal is substantive um, here. So generally, sentences work in terms of subject, verb, object, um, or if we're speaking in terms of cases, nominative, verb, accusative cases. Although verb is not really a case if we're thinking about verbs, just show inflection that might show the case that we might be in. But this isn't a grammar lecture, so we'll continue. So premise one, all men are mortal. Premise two, Socrates was a man. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates was mortal. So we see that premise two includes term A, right? Man, men, but introduces a new term, C. When we look at the conclusion, term C, um, uh, Socrates is introduced and equated with the singular form a. So what happens is we're able over through dialectic formally when we say something like Socrates was mortal, is we basically are erasing that term man, right? If you look at what like we're like crossing it out, like if we're doing long division by hand, if we're doing math that way, right? We don't need that anymore. We've dealt with that term, and then we can continue on and Socrates was mortal can now be a premise for furthering our dialogue or our dialectic. It's called synthesis, right? We take A and we've got B, and then we've got a new term C, and then we're able to cancel out A by synthesizing C and B. And so if you were to take a formal logic class or a symbolic logic class, or sometimes what people call these days analytical philosophy, you end up dealing with a whole language of symbology, and things look like math equations. That's not my area of philosophy. I come from a continental tradition that uh, deals with things in a different manner, especially that deals with things with a heavy sense of history at work. And it's also my literary background that makes me focus on historical context. Uh, so dialectical thinking is illustrative of how formal logic works. Dialectical comes from the Greek dialogos, right? It means through words. And Aristotle says that rhetoric is a kind of counterpart of dialectic. Uh, he comes up with this term enthymeme for talking about practical discourse. We don't speak in formal logical syllogisms when we're talking to each other, and especially when we're trying to really persuade other people. Um, and so, uh, what we kind of naturally do, Aristotle says, is we take things for granted, especially if we know people in our audience. Like if I talk to my friend um, uh, yesterday, and we encountered a third friend of mine yesterday. I can talk to one of those friends today, and probably reference um, kind of offhand or something. The conversation that we had yesterday. I don't need to walk them through what was said when we spoke yesterday, right? Because I know that they were there and they experienced the same situation. So Aristotle uses this term enthymeme to discuss when a speaker creates what's called a truncated or shortened syllogism based on audience awareness. So we're still making an argument, but we might be leaving some things out, or we might just be assuming some things. So if we take that formal syllogism from the previous slide, all men are mortal, Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates is or was mortal. Um, the enthymeme version would be something like, because Socrates was a man, he was going to die at some point. And um, so we assume in that statement that the listener knows that there's something about living a human life that is based on mortality. If we were to change the terms here and throw Jesus Christ in instead of Socrates, all men are mortal. Jesus Christ was a man, therefore Jesus Christ was mortal. For some people, that's going to be logically sound and just fine. For other people who are believing Christians, they might want to see something more at work. And of course, there were lots and lots of philosophical discussions during the first 1,000 years of Christianity, dealing with the nature of the Trinity and whether or not Jesus Christ was a person, full human person, or was always God or something like that, right? So now we're at like that a kind of example between belief and knowledge, right? And that's why we need rhetoric, says Aristotle, because we're going to be encountering situations where we don't have clear answers to things and where we might be tempted to be persuaded by something that might not be quite logical or might not even be true because of other factors. So uh, being aware of what an enthymeme is helpful for us in tracking other people's arguments when they're making assumptions about us. But when we're writing our own arguments or when we're composing our own speeches, it's also helpful because when we leave out necessary information, it tells us something about what we're assuming our audiences already know. Um, so yeah, like these video lectures, for example, I can I am assuming that some of my watchers have read some of these Platonic dialogues, but I'm not assuming complete knowledge of it all. And I'm refreshing some of the things that happen in the earlier dialogues, partly for my students who have read those dialogues in recent weeks along with me, but also in a way that people who are broader and not in my face-to-face classes are able to hopefully get something out of this video too, right? So we're always making choices as rhetoricians or orators. The word rhetoric comes from that same root as the word orator that we get in English. We are always making decisions about our based on our perception of what our audiences know or do not know. So in Plato's Meno, if we think back to that, it's overtly a discourse on the nature of virtue. What is virtue? But towards the very, very end of the text, um, uh, Socrates and Meno have been discussing things for a while. And whether the question is kind of whether or not virtue is teachable or not. Or and so is it knowledge? Is it belief? Is it teachable? Is it something that we learn? Is it something that we have intrinsically? Is it part of our soul's memory, like something from a that we're remembering that we've forgotten as we've grown older, but we remember in this kind of reincarnation sense of the soul that Socrates has, that we somehow forget things in this life, but life is a process of remembering what true reality is. So that's a different kind of metaphysics than I think that some of most people that I interact with on a daily basis have. So at the end, Socrates is saying, making some distinctions about knowledge and belief. And belief is going to be tied for Aristotle to persuasion. There's something Aristotle says that is about something that really is true that has a kind of intrinsic persuasion about it. Like we kind of naturally recognize when something is true and then we're persuaded by it. Um, uh, um, so Socrates here says that and that which guides correctly is both useful and good. Meno says certainly. Socrates says here, and that only these two things, true belief and knowledge, guide correctly. That if a person possesses these, that person gives correct guidance. The things that turn out right by chance are not due to human guidance, but where there is correct human guidance, it is due to two things, true belief and knowledge. But what happens when we have false belief? So what Socrates is kind of saying here is that like, yeah, we might not know everything, but if we do believe in something that is true, we're still going to be guided in the right direction. The problem is trying to find out what is true and what is not true, right? So belief by itself is not necessarily bad when we don't know things, but belief is going to be different than knowledge itself. Um, Aristotle says, yeah. So we might really need to study rhetoric to find out how persuasion and belief works, even if we're stepping a little bit outside of what knowledge is, or from that philosophical discourse that's going to try to figure out what the true nature of virtue is, which is what the Meno happens to be about. So, uh, Aristotle says if we think about rhetoric and we think about how people are persuaded, it seems to be that we use different kinds of modes. He distinguishes three kinds or genres of rhetoric. He says first we can think about like, well, if somebody's trying to convince me of something, they might refer to something that happened in the past, especially if I wasn't there as an eyewitness. He calls this forensic rhetoric, or sometimes called judicial rhetoric. It always deals with the past. And like in court cases, we're dealing with um, setting up the scene of a crime, or if you're thinking about, uh, forensics teams that go into crime scenes, what they're really trying to do is establish the facts of what actually happened. What is the sequence of events that occurred, right? Then there's epidiegetic rhetoric, which is I know is a mouthful, but it's also you can say call it ceremonial rhetoric, and this is the rhetoric like when if you're in a courtroom and the judge comes in and everybody stands up, or you're at a wedding and the bride starts walking down the aisle and everybody stands up together. Everybody sort of knows to do that, or if somebody doesn't know how to do it, they look around pretty quickly and they are convinced to stand up too. So we can also think about wedding speeches, bride and groom dances are really or like father daughter dances in some weddings, right? We things that are repeated ceremonially throughout different events. We can think about singing the national anthem before sporting events or taking a knee, like when that form of protest is used, as was recently used in the United States, where we had football players taking a knee during the national anthem. What they were doing was drawing attention to the situation that some people's lives um, uh, uh, um, not tension, but to the situation that some people's lives have in the United States, where because of ongoing racism, for example, Black lives are not treated with the same equity that white lives are, and so we get like the slogans like Black Lives Matter, or the campaigns for that kind of situation. But when the action is happening in the actual formal ceremony, this is a version of epidiegetic rhetoric. Then there's deliberative rhetoric, which is dealing with the future, says Aristotle. And that's where we're going to put place politics. And some of my students, we were talking this week about what is a definition of politics. And I was leading you along in class, asking you to look up definitions of politics because I wanted to draw your attention to this when I gave you this lecture on rhetoric, that when we're dealing with politics, according to Aristotle, we're dealing with deliberations about the future possibilities and actions, how society ought to go. Um, so we don't want to just like avoid political discussion or saying mere politics or mere rhetoric. Um, there is one kind of rhetoric, according to Aristotle, that is really concerned with the future of our society. And it has to be something that we come to democratic forms of agreement on. And so there's nothing mere about it, right? It's actually very serious business, according to Aristotle. Um, uh, I get it because one of my students in class was talking about like, oh, well, the concept of abortion and the debates about abortion in the United States came up as an example in a conversation, and a student said, I don't want to talk about politics, right? It's like, well, like for Aristotle, we if we're talking about rhetoric and we're talking about politics, it's not just like it's not just politics. It's like we get angry and maybe come to blows with each other about political ideas because they're tied, just like Socrates says, into the deepest ideals and values of what we are as a society and who we take to be as our ethical individual persons, right? So Aristotle also says that if we're going to look at facts and we're going to look at the ways that people try to prove things, we can look at two kinds of proofs, especially. We can look at inartistic proofs, which is generally observable facts. They're self-evident and unmediated. It's like that question that Socrates brings up all the time. Yes, if it's how many people are in the room, we can count the number of people if we disagree, and we can come to a really easy agreement. Nobody is going to um, uh, uh, be debating the counting of the issue. But when it comes to something abstract, that's when we're going to come to blows, or we're going to need more context, or we're going to need more explanation. And in that sense, artistic proofs need more explanation and context. So when we think about something like, I don't know, the abortion debate, right? Uh, which oftentimes gets registered along the lines of religious arguments, right? But when we look historically at even Catholic Christianity, right? When we look historically, um, uh, the idea that conception is when life begins is very, very recent. It's only comes after scientists in the 1860s start figuring out what biological cells are, right? And so then there are shifts within the Catholic Church that change the moment of life from being at the quickening, which is when you're going into labor, right, to this idea of conception, right? So in order for that change to happen historically, um, in order for people to make this kind of argument, even about the idea of conception, it relies on assumed knowledge that we have these days about biology and cells forming and eggs like being fertilized by sperm, which when we look at Shakespearean times or something where there's this like in Midsummer Night's Dream, the conception is that like the sperm is has a kind of like it acts on the egg like imprinting on wax or something like that, right? So that people are using the technology of their time, like when you dip a stamp into wax to seal a paper or something like that. There's something official going on in the father almost like stamping his likeness into the egg, which is not like doesn't work scientifically for the way that we think about things today, right? So a lot of times today we will refer to scientific discoveries that are now taken to be as fact, um, because we've become comfortable with them. Uh, it's easy to refer to them as fact without us realizing that our human knowledge has changed over time historically and requires unless you have learned about biology and cells and how that the human body works in a particular way, you won't necessarily know how that stuff happens. So when we talk about contemporary debates on abortion or something like that, right, or stem cells, which was a big part of the abortion debates for especially for Catholics, for example, like what happens now when we can reverse engineer stem cells from somebody in their 70s? You can reverse engineer an adult stem cell all the way back to a pluripotent stage, right? Not a totipotent stage, but like, what are all of these technical terms? Totipotent, pluripotent, all of this. What does that have to do with stem cells? What does that have to do with conception of life? All of that is going to be wrapped up in artistic proofs and scientific knowledge, which most people don't have. And so people make all sorts of assumptions and judgments about issues like abortion based on limited amounts of information, much to the dismay of scientists. Um, uh, So in contemporary times, what I like to tell my students is that because we live in such a highly mediated environment all the time, it's there aren't a lot of inartistic proofs that we have. Even though I think we talk about things, we might mention facts as if they're inartistic proofs. But like a statistic is still an artistic proof. You have to have done some sort of study and to come up with your sample group and all of that sort of stuff, to come up with the idea that like as Pew Research says, like X% of Americans believe that the United States should be a Christian country or something like that, right? That's all artistic proofs, even though we tend to sometimes look at numbers and think of them in terms of arithmetic or something or as if numbers were them by themselves compelling without like looking into how they've been developed in terms of study and statistics. So, I mean, statistics is a rather recent um, uh, 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 way of studying and thinking about numbers, definitely different from classical arithmetic, geometry, and those sorts of disciplines that we deal with in mathematics. Um, In addition, so when we're thinking about the ways that things get proved, there's artistic and inartistic proofs, and Aristotle develops not so much in the rhetoric, but famously in other places in his physics he talks about the four causes, which relate to ontology, or that branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of being and changes in nature. So remember, I said earlier that in Aristotle, there is this idea that like nature is always in motion, it's always in a kind of flux and change. And uh, um, we can look at later philosophers on the nature of things. I'm thinking of as one particular text that has this concept that really like the true metaphysical reality is like a whole flux of we'll call them atoms. Although the atom wasn't really quote discovered, it was being discussed in ancient times, but it wasn't really discovered until the 19th century as well. In the way, at least in the way the subatomic particles like nucleus and different aspects of an atom, proton and um, electron and neutron, all that kind of stuff. That's not much more recent ways of thinking about the world, but definitely in ancient times, there's this idea that from looking at the stars in the sky that things are in flux, like things are always moving. And Aristotle comes up with the idea of the prime mover, whoever it was or whatever it was that set the universe in motion itself. Call it a god if you want, but the term that shows up in Aristotle is prime mover. And so when we're looking at actual things in the world, even facts, Aristotle says, well, we can look at the way things come to be in different uh, in terms of four different causes. First is the material cause, which is going to be the substance or the mechanism that something is made from. Second is going to be the formal cause, the model or the essence of something. And so by formal here, he's kind of thinking a little bit more like the Platonic sense, right? If I'm going to build a table, I have an idea of what a table is in my head, and I'm mimicking that or copying that in order to make a table in real life or in physical life. I don't know which one is real or not, right? So the efficient cause then is the trigger or the starting point of change. What causes things to come into action? Is it like my axe chopping the wood that I'm going to make the table from, right? And then there's the final cause, the function or the purpose of something. So there's something about, again, this is related a little bit. You can see how it's related to Platonic forms. There's something in my idea of the table that guides me towards making this thing that functions as something to put my computer on while I give my video lectures or to eat dinner at. There's something about like I know when I'm starting to make something, what I'm going to make, and that's why I've been using kind of the meno here as an example here, because in Plato's Meno, um, uh, the idea of whether or not virtue can be taught, the kind of contradiction. There's like, how do we ever really know something unless we know something about it to look for the thing that we don't know, right? What kind of a priori knowledge, what kind of prior knowledge might we have about the subject that is causing us to be driven towards answers to a specific kind of question? And of course, and for Socrates, it leads into ideas of the soul. So I'm gotta move my face here. So all of this will kind of be hovering behind what Aristotle and rhetoricians call the rhetorical situation. When we're talking about rhetoric, we're always talking about an audience-driven situation, and we can think about it in its most basic terms, in terms of who is speaking, who is being addressed, and what is the exigence. So this term is actually a word that comes from Latin, and so the ex means from out of, right? And gen like Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, right? The first book of the Hebrew Bible, like the beginning, right? That's one way to think of it, of exigence, or exigency is an urgent need or demand. So what causes bring about the situation that needs to be addressed? When the President of the United States gives the State of the Union address, it is not the subject of the State of the Union to be addressing in robust terms either how good the president's basketball game was the day before, or unless it's directly related to domestic situations, foreign policy, for example, right? It's the State of the Union. How is the nation doing at this particular moment in time, and what are the factors to address? So there's a particular exigence that's determined by time and temporality. Uh, Moving on here. Aristotle, of course, I've got his dates here. Um, he um, uh, comes up with these terms in his rhetoric as he is analyzing the encomium of Helen by Gorgias. And this is commonly taught in high school classes. And the way it's commonly taught is that ethos is credibility, pathos is emotional appeal, logos is structure and reason. These are the conventional definitions. My students often know them when they come into the university, but we need to be a little bit more nuanced at the level that I'm delivering this information at. So when we look back at Aristotle, if we were actually to read his rather boring book, The Rhetoric, um, we get this definition for ethos or pathos, as it would be pronounced in Greek. Custom, manner, place, habit, or dwelling. So what's different about the conventional ways about credibility here, which comes from a Latin word, credo, right? Credo would be I believe in Latin. So when we're dealing with ethos, we're thinking about believability. But for Aristotle, when we look back at the way that he frames it, it's going to be where somebody comes from. Like being an Athenian is going to be part of one's ethos. Sometimes people talk about ethos close to ethnos or like an external like characteristic of a people. As one of my students brought up in class earlier this week. But if you look at the etymology, um, uh, uh, yes, like later in the 1800s, people might have used the term ethos in terms of like that kind of public persona that's more like ethnos. But when we look, trace it back to the Greek, trace it back to where Aristotle is dealing with it in the Poetics, and he says that it has to do with customs, it has to do with where you're from, has to do with your habits, has to do with how you live. And I think that that's a much richer sense of what goes into this concept of credibility that we might be giving to someone, right? Um, Pathos is often taught in high schools as being a kind of emotional appeal, and I think that that's the one that's most damaging. First of all, there is this like sense that is completely wrong by current science, and I don't think it's exactly right to even frame it as if the Greek philosophers only thought of reason as being above emotion, although I can see in Socrates' sense of like, yes, the wise philosopher individuals have rationality, and it's rationality that keeps us in check. There has been historically a sense that like, especially since the Enlightenment in Europe, that reason somehow is like the more divine idea, and that some emotions or pathos or something lesser or something. It's not that hierarchical, I think, when we're thinking about it, at least in Aristotle's rhetoric. And instead of just being an emotional appeal, um, uh, we might think of it in terms of the appropriate attention to the concerns of any given audiences. And yes, there are emotions. If your audience is really mad and like protesting about something, you want to address their concerns, right? Um, uh, or you might be trying to get your audience riled up to protest because that's what you want to convince them to do. But it's really about being aware of who they are and what their concerns might be, right? If you were like giving a lecture on like abortion policies to a bunch of 5-year-olds, like their concerns are not going to be the same concerns. They're trying to tell them about um, pluripotent stem cells or something like that. They don't know. They don't have the context. So we need to be able to approach audiences from where they're at and what their concerns are. And that's not a lessening or a diminishing about what characterizes our emotions and our feelings, the things that we care about. Logos or logos, again, the word mean in Greek, logos means word or language or representational choice. In current linguistics, there's a scholar named Vershawn Ashanti Young, also goes by the name Vey. He has a famous book called Other People's English, where he talks about the ways that when people speak African American vernacular English, they sometimes get judged in certain ways, versus a false notion of something like a standard English. We might there is no like standard English, and linguistic scholars have tried to say what a myth that is, right? Like speak standard English. There are standards within what we might call edited academic English, right? Like the ways that people conventionally write papers, and people get marked down for having certain papers and things like that. So it might matter. You might take on the concerns of your professor if you're writing a essay for a college class, right? And at what point, when you are adapting your language to another person's concerns or to a person in authority's concerns, are you able to keep true to who you are, to your own authentic self, or are you handing yourself over to a different context, which oftentimes has happened for people who speak African American vernacular English, was or certainly not only African American people, right? You can be a Euro Christian or a white person and grow up speaking African American English as well. Eminem being a really good example of that, of a person who employs African American English in his art as a rapper. So Logos is going to deal with structure and organization and the components that we use to create our argument, right? If we're talking, we could apply it to music as well. We could talk about notes, harmony, rhythm, and those sorts of things as well as part of the logical structure. In addition to those three terms, so I've given you more elaborate definitions than the high school definitions of credibility, emotional appeal, and structure. Um, I'm also going to add the terms kairos, which is just a way of thinking about timing. So why does it matter? Why now in 2023? Why now in 2024 as I'm making this video, right? I made the slides in 2023. What's changed? A lot has changed in the past year, especially when we talk about global politics and humanitarian situations. And then exigence. I already covered that word earlier from out of the beginning, the call to speak or why this matters. There's a really famous, if you're really interested in rhetoric, there's a really, really famous essay from 1968 by Lloyd Bitzer called The Rhetorical Situation, where he talks about the term exigence. And then there's also another really important essay called Rethinking the Rhetorical Situation from a Thematic of Difference by Barbara B. Secker. So our discourse and rhetoric even changes historically over time too. But if you're wondering where I'm getting that term exigence, it comes from Lloyd Bitzer. Uh, my students, when we're talking about rhetoric and when we're talking about argumentation, often use the term bias in a way that I find too loose. There is a sense that, like, yes, we all have our own predispositions. We might have some cognitive biases that might be unconscious. But generally speaking, when we're talking about rhetoric and argumentation, when we talk about bias, we're talking about something that's unexamined and unreflective in someone's stance, and oftentimes that's based on fallacious or um, uh, uh, fallacious thinking or thinking that's full of errors, right? Such as appeals to authority or tradition or to one's own worldview. So. An informed position. So like sometimes my students will say like, oh, because they identify that somebody has an argument and it's like, well, they're just biased because they are a Christian, or they're just biased because they're a Republican, or they're Democrat. And I know that they're a Republican and that because of their party system, they're automatically biased, or the Democrats are all biased. They only think about Democrat identity positions. You can have a position in an argument that you are aware of, right? And it can still be ethical if you know where you're coming from. So an informed position knows both its own quote agenda and where it comes from. It's tempered itself against opposing perspectives and formulated rationales to support its position, including methods to determine why others should see such a support as relevant. I mean, we can go back to Plato, right? Like it's Plato, Socrates doesn't assume we're all going to agree on things. It's not just a matter of presenting information and everybody gets it automatically. We have to find a way to discuss things together, and we won't be on the same page about things. Um, we want to work collaboratively in our argumentations with each other to move toward a given end together, right? But whether, and I think that goes for both Plato or for Aristotle. So being able to determine an author's or a speaker's position is not the same as calling them biased. We need to do a little bit more work when it comes to think about an author's credibility and our own credibility. Sometimes we need to be aware of our own limitations, right? Like I'm a 47-year-old male person. This body is not going to carry a baby ever in this lifetime. It might be in the future that technology allows people who are born XY in their chromosomes to carry babies. This is a weird, almost like science fiction type of idea, but it's weird how technology is changing for the human bodies. It's weird that we have, in addition to the four natural base pairs that make up our DNA, we now, since 2018, have two more synthetic base pairs. So we are really dealing at the edge of what might be considered traditionally biologically human to begin with in terms of our species. Um, Really, really interesting stuff, right? So I might still have opinions about uh something like abortion, for example. But this body is never going to experience the position of um, being pregnant and being concerned about, whether or not it's going to be healthy to bring that pregnancy to term, right? So might be important to have a little bit of a limitation on an awareness of the limitations of my own knowledge when it comes to that particular debate and to positions in that debate. So we want to be to the best extent that we can, be aware of our own limitations. And if somebody points out biases that we might have, sure, that's something to be taken into consideration. But just knowing that somebody is making an argument and has a position is not enough to just point at them and call them biased. For example, in Colorado, where I live, and other states, in recent years. There's been the legalization of marijuana, which used to be a Schedule One restricted, or well, it still is a federally restricted substance. So it's against federal law, but the states have legalized, a few states, California, Colorado, Oregon, a couple of others now, have legalized marijuana. So the law has changed. Are the states here being merely reckless, or are they taking a specific position on whether or not they think that that substance it really is as dangerous as the federal drugs scheduling makes it out to be? Um, I would say that those state legislatures have come up with informed positions in which they're challenging the federal government on that particular issue. Another example, at Metro State University, where I often teach, or University of Denver, where I not as often, but sometimes teach. Both a private university like University of Denver and a public state university like MSU Denver have accepted undocumented students, or illegal aliens. Many cities throughout the United States have also declared themselves to be, quote, sanctuary cities or sanctuary campuses. It's an interesting term. What makes it sanctuary? And it has its own history that I'm not going to go into here. Um, when institutions such as these take these positions, the positions have legal and political ramifications, and they are identifiable. But that does not mean that they are simply biased. They're informed positions that have ethics and values, that are being reflected in what we take our job as educators to be in those places. And I know a little bit more just because I worked at Metro State much longer. Much of my career has been at Metro State University of Denver. And the position that we have is that like our job as a center of higher education is to give access to higher education to the populace that exists in Metro Denver. If there is a high amount of illegal uh, aliens or non-citizen adults who don't have not citizenship status, having a bunch of adults who are not educated is worse for our society than it is to uh, have them be in existence, whether or not they're being deported, or which is a whole national discussion, right? While they are here, while adults are here, adults should have access to public education, is the position that the state university that I work for. I happen to agree with that position, as a personal individual as well. So that's nice when you agree with the public positions of your university or institution. So I have this question, does taking a stand make them less or more credible as institutions? You might have different opinions about that, but I would not say that you calling University of Denver or MSU Denver just biased really is um, really covers the thought that's gone in for why we might take the positions that we take as educational institutions. Another thing that Aristotle comes up in Aristotle's thinking is that he spends a lot of time on logic. And so this is not so much in the rhetoric, although logic is part of rhetoric or logos, right? So he's got the four causes, which are not all dealt with a lot in the rhetoric, and then there are also like the square of opposition. But you can see how some of this might be at work behind formal logical syllogisms, like all SRP, no SRP. That creates a binary distinction. Sometimes people talk about binary logic or ones and zeros like computers, but in Aristotle, we can already see that he's making room for a level of things where there's all or nothing, but there's also some. So some S are P, some are not P, and we can use like Venn diagrams like this shows up here with circles for things that cross over conceptually. The terms, I'm just wanting to introduce students to the terms right now for this kind of stuff. So we might have an A and a B or S and P here. A subject predicate is, I think, is what they're going for kind of there for putting it in sentence terms. But so there's contraries, like on one level. Below that, there are these things called the subalterns, where we have sub, which means under, right? An alternative. And so it might take on a contradictory category. So all of these terms that we tend to use in kind of regular everyday speech, like, oh, that person contradicted themselves. Aristotle is going to have a really technical sense of what constitutes a contradiction, logically speaking, just to throw that out there. Um, my students inevitably ask around when we're first talking about logic and persuasion and how if we're being persuaded by cookie feeds or if we're being persuaded by, you know, like what news media we consume, which I think determines a lot of people's positions on votes because they live in a bubble and they don't hear other sides of things. So the question often comes up, what does logic still even matter? And it's like, yes, logic definitely matters. Like, but we also need to understand at a deeply historical level what the idea of logic means. So again, this is kind of showing my continental historical background as opposed to analytic philosophy or symbolic logic, which I think for those people, like symbolic people doing the symbolic logic, they're like, yes, if, not only is it important, it's the most important thing, and it's the thing that's only real all the time. That's a little bit of a different position than of somebody who comes from the continental tradition like me. So um, conceptions of that, the value of logic change over time. So in Roman times, there's a lot more emphasis on emotional means of persuasion, of an ethical means, being a good person and being a good speaker. But then when it comes to the medieval era, like with someone like Thomas Aquinas, who wants to return to Aristotle's logic and say like, oh, even though Aristotle is a pre-Christian thinker, he was really on to something. So then logic has a whole lot of sway. And then in the Renaissance, as people are rediscovering Plato, the rebirth is what the Renaissance means. Then all of a sudden there's a flood of logic, or sorry, a flood of rhetorical terms coming back in to play with things. And so we get like the rhetorical flourishing that shows up in Shakespeare plays, for example. So there's a kind of like uh, uh, differing kinds of tensions between logic and rhetoric. Like, and that's why I think Aristotle's useful for thinking like that. Really, it's like like well, rhetoric is kind of a counterpart to dialectic. Uh, in most receptions that we inherit, at least in the United States where I'm working, we inherit a Eurocentric and sometimes, and in quotes here, whitely is a term that's shown up recently. I tend to use the term Euro-Christian because the Christian aspects of the and European aspects of the political systems that we inherit actually come before color-based systems about race, which also have no biological basis, as we know now, but people didn't necessarily know in the 19th century. In Greek terms of style, logic expresses an interesting way of looking at the world that is not the only way of looking at the world. For example, we might look at some categories like human versus non-human. Even the Greeks, before the Christians, developed like ideas of personal dignity that the Catholics take into their positions on something like abortion, for example, which has been a theme. Uh, um, in the Judaic tradition in Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, but also in Greek culture, there is this distinction between human and non-human. But when we look at indigenous cultures, and particularly Native American perspectives, um, other animals, it's not like they don't notice between the difference between us as a species and other animals, but the other animals are considered to be relatives, and then most of the time to be older relatives that we owe respect to. So, completely different way that logic might work within that kind of Native American or indigenous cultural perspective that doesn't assume automatically that humans are on top or the pinnacle of creation. Um, uh, so we have inherited ideas of logic in its modern sense that are often part of a specific Western political tradition or traditions. Oftentimes, right behind that is some sort of theological or Christian, in particular, basis for things. And if we really want to, if you're of the persuasion that we ought not have those ideas, which is an enlightenment centered way of thinking, right? That like that we should have a separation of church and state or something like that, then we really need to unpack and try to understand where theological metaphysics are underlying our notions of law and politics and the ways that we've set up our countries. That's really, really difficult work to do. It takes a lot of academic knowledge to do that kind of work. So, we should think, I suggest, not just in terms of absolute versus relative. Is there a capital T truth or is there a small t truth, right? Absolute or relativistic, but in terms of tradition and what Aristotle saw as inartistic proofs, which are facts versus artistic proofs. Any kind of religion is going to be dealing with artistic proofs. Um, it's a good idea today in the 21st century to see most facts as artistic proofs. Like, even if we're talking about cells, our naked eyes can't see cells. You have to have developed the technology of the microscope to see things that small. And yeah, I think that I think that I'm not saying that that's not a way that when we're thinking about like subatomic particles and physics and things like that, that's not a true way of thinking about the universe and reality, or we're talking about dark energy and dark matter now, which these very, very mysterious things that seem to hold the universe together, or spooky action at a distance, and all of these concepts, which I think I'm not at all being anti-science when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I do think that if we look at Aristotle and we think about logic, if we say that, like, yeah, most of what we encounter in contemporary life is being mediated in some sort of form through technology. I don't know how to make a computer. Like, I don't really know how binary logic works. If I really, really like read about it and study it for a while, I can kind of see how it works. And it's fascinating how binary logic goes into computers and eventually forming things like the microchip and being able to condense more and more in the smallest types of environments, vast amounts of knowledge, right? That's really, really interesting stuff, but I don't really know how that works or how this can if my camera stops working, I can't fix that right away. And so this is what Martin Heidegger had his name on an earlier slide, called in the 1950s in this essay, he's the essay concerning technology. The idea that that we don't necessarily live a life based on direct experience. Although some people might claim that in a theological sense, in a sense of revelation or something like that, which is very interesting to be thinking about rhetoric and revelation. If we think about that passage from uh, Plato's Meno, for example, like the idea that we live in that reincarnation is the basis of things. I think that most people who are basing religious ideas these days, at least in the United States, who are basing it on Christian ideas, are not necessarily thinking about it in terms of reincarnation that seem to be fundamental to the Socratic notion of the soul and how the soul exists. So we might think about different contexts for our metaphysics, and having a discussion of logic is not like logic versus rhetoric, right? Logical persuasion might be one of the means at our disposal for coming to believe something or be persuaded. And it might be reliable in some instances, and it might not be always entirely reliable. Since we think about something like race, for example, right? In the 19th century, It was considered scientific knowledge that there were some sort of biological determinations um, uh, between so-called races. And now we know that that's not real. That's not true. It's bunk science now, right? So even our belief, we might rest some sort of knowledge in for good reason on scientific discoveries, we also have to be aware that we live in a changing world. We live in a historical world, and that might bring us into having a little bit of flexibility. I'm teaching a class right now called History of the Self, and my college students constantly want to use concepts of the self that are Freudian or that are post-Darwinian. Um, and I'm like, you guys, that's really interesting. I can see how we're so formed by those ideas of the self even in the 21st century. But before the 1800s, people thought about the self differently. They thought about subjectivity differently. We have to have a kind of historical sense there. And this definitely comes into this concept of ideology, which I'm going to be getting towards the end of my lecture with here. Ideology, uh, um, as a noun. It first shows up if we looked it up in the dictionary, like in 1796, as the science of ideas. Originally, the philosophy of the mind, which derives knowledge of the senses, as opposed to metaphysics. From the French, ideology, study of sciences or of ideas. Later on, the term ideology becomes it takes on pejoration. We have a negative sense of this, and this comes from thinkers like Karl Marx. So the term ideology wasn't really widely used until the 19th century. And as one critic says here, it was only after the appearance of Karl Marx's long unpublished German ideology and Karl Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia in the period between the world wars of 20th century that the term became an omnipresent one. But these days, it means something like a systematic set of ideas or doctrines through which the world is interpreted. Um, and uh, when people are talking about, oh, somebody's brainwashed to somebody else's ideology, or the sense that ideology is an illusion, it's a way of looking at reality, that it's a false way of looking at reality. That kind of language definitely comes out of Marxian analyses. In the 19th century, and they're useful for sure, right? But what Marx is kind of trying to say is that, like, a lot of times we live in an ideological reality that kind of masks the historical forces that are at work in shaping even our ideas about how the world works. Um, if I shift really quickly to a philosopher friend of mine, Dr. Sarah Pessin over at University of Denver. She has a project, kind of a rhetoric project called Civic Salamander, where it's on Instagram. You can follow it if you want. And so here's just one of her slides that she uses here. Tootsie Pop politics. When you think that deep down we're all the same, what she's doing is calling out in an ethical sense, and particularly because I know Sarah, she's thinking about a philosopher like Emmanuel Levinas, who's a Jewish ethical philosopher. Um, uh, if you think everybody is the same deep down and that's the way you're going to base your politics, then you're going to be blinded to inequities that might occur in terms of gender or sexual orientation or race or something like that. Because you're believing that everybody is sort of living in the same world that you're living in, right? So she calls it Tootsie Pop politics based on a 1970s commercial in the United States about the candy Tootsie Pops. We can look at other contemporary work outside of philosophy, and this is where some of my own other work deals with outside of just a philosophical discourse on Plato and Aristotle, right? Cognitive linguistics tells us that, like, so Enlightenment logic or Enlightenment positions or Enlightenment ideology said that logic and reason is the most important thing that humans have, and it's the only way that we should think about reality, and that we should then use that to base our scientific discourse on logic. And when we look now, actually from current science, it tells us that our brains don't exactly work that way. Our brains are structured in terms of neurons, and neurons that create synaptic firings in our brains, and they create kind of like to use a metaphor, a kind of superhighway of thoughts. Like it's just like a muscle in our body gets strengthened by being used over time. The things that we are exposed to at a young age, and even when we're in the womb, we now know that um, if your mom if your mom has talked to you a lot in your womb, or you've been encountering people even reading stories, there are lots of things that we get linguistically as young humans while we're still inside the womb, like pitch and inflection, that might be culturally different. So like Vietnamese is a very pitch oriented language, but we still use pitch in English too, right? So when we finish a question, we usually raise the pitch of our voice, like, do you understand what I'm saying? Saying, or it goes up in pitch like that. And we oftentimes raise our pitch when we're talking to babies. We go into like baby talk or baby voice. Um, uh, there's a lot of similarities about how language is ingested, but then there's different ways that languages determine our reality, right? Like it can be like if we're thinking about a pitch-oriented language, like Southeastern languages, Southeast Asian languages rather. If you don't use the right pitch, you might have a really different meaning for a word. So, linguistic meaning, from a cognitive science perspective, is perspectival. Meaning shapes the world and the worldview rather than us living in a sense where, like, I have this logical brain and it's mirroring an outside reality, like subjectivity versus objectivity, or like the claims, like, be objective in your argument. It's like that's not really how our brains necessarily work. Linguistic meaning is dynamic and it's flexible. It relies on family resemblances. So, what our brains do when we encounter something new is we categorize it according to a frame that we already know that seems um, useful to us. So, when Euro-Christian colonizers come to the continents that we now call the Americas, because of their theology and the ways that they thought about the history of the world, when they encountered other humans being types of things, they're like, well, they appear to be human, but how did they get here? Because they don't work in our frames into any of our theological frames. So are they like some sort of lost tribe of Israel? Are they Satan's spawn? Are they even human to begin with? Are they beasts of some sort of kind? And so you have these debates in the 1500s about um, just how human are the indigenous peoples of what becomes the Americas, because it doesn't fit in the Euro-Christian worldview's frames that they had to begin with, right? So eventually they start having people like Bartolome de las Casas and the Valladolid debates, right? Uh, Arguments that yes, indeed they are human, but maybe they are not as cultivated or as quote civilized as these European Christians. And so then we get this kind of like scale of advancement in terms of civilizations. And then later on in the 19th century, that's going to be mapped on to ideas of evolution, where Eurocentric people are going to say that they are somehow more evolved or more civilized than other people around the world. And then they're going to place that within biological sciences as well. And then they're going to place ideas of race within there as well. Um, and it ends up being a frame or a worldview that's like encountering new phenomena in the world and wrongfully categorizing it according to a particular perception that's been developed not just within one generation, but over, 2 millennia at least. So interesting ways of thinking about what goes into our cognitive makeup. It's much more than the John Locke idea that we're just born a blank slate, a tabula rasa, right? Because there's a society that produced us and languages that produced the ability for the people to get together and fertilize us, either in vitro or through conventional ways that human beings have sexual encounters with each other, right? So there's a lot that goes into the makeup of even ourself as biological entities. Uh, Linguistic meaning is reflective of that broader experience. So we can look to language to show us an illustration of how we think about something like worldview. Um, but even our linguistic meaning is based on usage and experience over time. And so when we're thinking about the ways that people are persuaded or not persuaded in terms of 21st century stuff, we want to think about concepts of identity and identity formation or self formation or cognitive formation. We lose trillions of cells. Doesn't mean that we don't still have cells and we can like that our brains can't change, or we might have like some sort of plasticity to our brains, but that between the ages of 0 and 5 years old, we have many, many, many possible connections that kind of get reduced down to what becomes our perception of reality. It's not a reflection of an outside reality, it is the neurological connections from a cognitive science perspective anyway. uh, the neurological connections are what establish what we think of as real. It is reality. It's not a metaphor. It's not a representation. It actually is reality itself, although it might not correspond to the cognitive reality of a bat, for example, to take a famous philosophical example. So we want to think about current persuasion in terms of frames. And so one of the classic texts on this is Charles Fillmore, and he says the concept of a frame does not depend on language, but as applied to the language processing, the notion figures in the following way. Particular words or speech formulas or particular grammatical choices are associated in memory with particular frames. So when I'm thinking about a frame here, just a metaphor in one sense, like all language is metaphorical. So it's like a picture frame. It's something that boxes in something that contains something else. If you're in my philosophy classes, it goes back to that discussion in Euthyphro about colors, right? And Euthyphro and Meno, right, basically talking about colors and shapes, right? We need to have an idea of shape that contains the thing that is the effluvium or the color, because then the shape is what gives boundaries to say that this color is different than something else. That's something that, so it's not like this stuff isn't in ancient philosophy, but cognitive science has a new way of talking about it. Particular words or speech formulas or particular grammatical choices are associated in memory with particular frames in such a way that exposure to linguistic form in an appropriate context activates in the perceiver's mind that the particular frame. Activation of the frame by turn enhances access to other linguistic material that's associated with the same frame. So what happens when we encounter something new is we associate it with the closest thing that we might perceive it to be. And then that might activate other associations that we have as well. So if you're constantly being told in the mediatized environment that you grow up that a certain kind of person that looks a certain kind of way is more likely to produce criminal activity or more likely to be a terrorist or something like that, right? Then what are our brains going to do when we encounter people that fit that category, or then we're going to associate that, and that's where biases can definitely come into play. It isn't just about being biased and being ignorant, it's about understanding the ways that our brains work and sometimes categorize differences or categorize novel experiences in ways that might not be true, especially when we're thinking about other people, that might not be true to actually how they are, certainly not how they perceive reality. But over time, if we're exposed over and over again to the same kinds of messaging about things, it's going to increase the stability of those neural pathways in our brains so that it will be hard to break. There are ways to think about breaking it. There are ways to think about it in terms of um, something like psychedelic medicines, for example, which I wrote my dissertations on, that definitely flood our synaptic firings and they give us a disoriented sense of thinking about the world or a sense of massive connection to the rest of nature or the rest of reality. When our default mode network in our brains is reduced actually to certain forms. Then we have actually like when the lights shut off, we actually have an outward sense of more unity, like a mystical unity with the rest of the universe. And we can have experiences like this, but both within mysticism and then also within kind of some taking a substance like a psychedelic substance, for example. What happens though is at the end of that drug-induced experience, or entheogen-induced experience, is we come back to have the same kind of neural network, the stabilized neural network that we've grown up with. And we might have some insight from an experience that gives us more than what we normally experience as reality. But that doesn't mean that we don't come back and still have behavior patterns that we will go right on repeating, uh, even though logically or emotionally we might even think like, oh, I had this other transcendent profound experience. It's like we can't live in that experience, that uh expanded experience all of the time. And so we will return to those the cognitive formation that we developed in the early years of our lives. And yeah, we can work with our brains. I can learn to play piano as an adult, and I get better over time, if I practice every day, but it's really, really hard to do that, to change our worldviews. And what we might do then is, if we're thinking in a rhetorical situation in the 21st century, when we're thinking about how difficult it is to change worldviews and how our cookies feeds and our computers and our social media is completely flooding us all the time with perceptions of reality, is to be aware that that's what's happening and find techniques to deal with the things that might create cognitive biases amongst ourselves. And we might also, rehabilitate some Greek notions of humility or the Greek notion of hubris, right? Too much excessive pride, which is right there back in Socrates and Aristotle and Sophocles and the Greek tragedies. It's like maybe we might just want to have like a little bit more humility when it comes to the ways that we interact with and argue with each other. What if the social value of something like humility takes precedence over being right all the time or winning an argument? If we return to a Socratic notion of argumentation, where it's really about working together, or as George Lakoff, a cognitive linguist, says in his famous book, Metaphors We Live By, we tend to talk about argument in our culture in terms of winning and losing. But what if we talked about argumentation within the metaphor of a dance, right? So uh, you can't be too loose. You can't have one partner if you're holding hands with a dance partner, right? You can't be have one person so loose that they can't be led by the other person, but you also can't be too rigid so that you can't be led, right? Instead, it's more like having a rubber band that's held not overly stretched so it's going to break, but it's like held within enough tension that when one person moves, the other person moves along with that person. So I think when we talk about academic argumentation and academic and rhetoric, what we're going for is not like having that kind of like, I've really said everything that needed to be said, and I'm going to drop the mic and walk away. deal with it. That's not what we're dealing with. We're actually trying to have a more nuanced and subtle and hopefully humble way of talking about how argumentation works. And if we are to be persuaded at all, we might, uh, even if we're not persuaded, perhaps at least find ways to live alongside of each other. But I think that if we are to be persuaded, like in a cognitive sense to someone else's position, it's more likely to happen if you're kind to somebody else, right? Whereas if you come in and you'd say like, you believe things my way or get out of here, right? That doesn't necessarily lead to ways of getting along with other people in society for sure. And I think that that's what's at the basis of understanding of rhetoric is knowing that we live in a society where people don't get along, don't expect that people are going to get along in a democracy, right? If the expectation is that you're always going to be right or somebody's always going to be right and they're just going to win all the time, that's just not the way that the society is going to work. So you're going to be disappointed over and over again, or you're going to be led towards some sort of like fascistic desire where you want a tyrant to tell you the way that that reality is. And that's just an anti-democratic society. So, towards the later part of Aristotle's Poetics, he does talk about the different kinds of society, like oligarchy, democracy, monarchy, and things like that as well. And rhetoric will look different according to different societies, but the value that I've been presenting here, at least in this opening kind of lecture on the subject, is uh, uh, the classic sort of democratic society. That what Aristotle says is that in a democratic society, we need a study of rhetoric because otherwise we are going to be exposed on a daily basis to means of persuasion where we don't even know that somebody's using means of persuasion to persuade us. So we are able to develop critical thinking skills. We're able to become better speakers ourselves, better rhetoricians or rhetors, and presenters of argument if we have some sort of study of the subject itself, rather than assuming, as Socrates does in the earlier dialogues, that it's just a knack. It's just something somebody might have talent for, or it's just cookery, as if eating well and having intention in the foods that we prepare doesn't actually relate to our well-being. I think that what Socrates means by cookery is something like eating at McDonald's every day. That's not going to be a very healthy way of dealing with things. So that is my introduction to rhetoric. Thank you for watching. And if you're in my classes, I will see you again in class after the next week. If you're not in my classes, I hope that you got something out of this video. Take care.